Good morning, everyone. My name is Wales, and this is my colleague Yecid, and our study is on anti-racist approaches to ESL, challenges and opportunities.
So before getting started, we would like to make a pause and reflect on what has happened in Canada in the past few weeks. First, the recent terrorist attack perpetrated last week in London, Ontario against a Muslim family, and also the discovery of unmarked Indigenous children graves in British Columbia.
So moving forward, we are going to share a little bit about who we are, talk about the guiding concepts and methodology, and present our preliminary findings along with future implications of this study. As part of this study, it is important to know a little bit about ourselves. I am American by birth. I am Asian Chinese. I am Canadian by citizenship. I use the pronouns she, her, they. I am a cisgender woman, a teacher, a student, and as a researcher. I recognize myself as what Milligan terms the in-betweener. I do not occupy only one identity at any given time. I understand myself as being perceived as one who is simultaneously inside and outside of a community, such as within the school context.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Wales. I'm a Latinx, mestizo, Colombian, Canadian, cisgender straight man. I am an immigrant and settler of this land. I have gender and language privilege. I am a human being in constant change, and I'm in the process of unlearning and relearning. I commit to dismantling white supremacy, anti-Black racism, colonization, and all sorts of discrimination against marginalized communities. I am an ally. I would say that nowadays different institutional statements have in being in solidarity with marginalized communities. And I also would say that words of solidarity on paper are not enough. So we must respond and act now and question whose knowledge counts and whose knowledge has been systematically marginalized. I have always been deeply concerned about issues affecting the most marginalized, that I decided to pay attention and collaborate with Wales to see what is possible or not from our lenses as educators and as researchers.
Yes, and so next we'll talk a little bit more about our guiding concepts.
Definitely, we would like to share the concepts that guide our work. So first, critical anti-racism refers to strategies, theories, actions, and practices that work to dismantle and counter inequalities, prejudice, and discrimination based on race, especially to dismantle binary ideas of how race has been constructed as a set of either or mentalities. That is, who is fully human, the white person, and who is not human, the racialized person. Therefore, we work and strive for English teaching within educational systems that challenge these binary categories and that promotes anti-racism. Second, an anti-racism theoretical framework allows us to understand the relationship between race and oppressive ideologies. We understand that in our work as educators and researchers, we can play an important role in addressing and dismantling racism while engaging in anti-oppression praxis. And by praxis, I mean actionable steps to keep dismantling these mindsets. Or as Freire said long ago, praxis as an act of liberation and destruction of all sorts of inequalities in marginalized communities. As they states that while schools are sites of indoctrination and reproduction of inequality, they are also sites of empowerment, resistance, and transformation. So we understand that in our work as educators and researchers, we can play an important role in addressing and dismantling racism while engaging in anti-oppression praxis. And what we mean by praxis is to action. Oh, sorry, I think I'm repeating myself. Sorry about, so in the end, for us, it is about speaking from perspective of oppressed peoples because we are speaking theory. And in a sense, Wales and I speak from our own positionalities as marginalized peoples.
Next, we'll talk a little bit about the methodology.
In order to address these issues, we use a duethnographic approach, and this is a collaborative effort in which two researchers juxtapose their life experiences in a process that typically involves converging at the same theme and specific phenomena from different angles as the subjects gain insights and knowledge through the course of a time-based frame. Duethnography fits in our context because we are both educators and we have worked with diverse students and we wanted to engage in conversations on what the possibilities and challenges are to introduce these topics in an ESL context.
And so the birth of this study was a result of a chat over coffee between Yecid and I. From there, we developed a vision of a dual ethnography, and over time, we continued our coffee chats in the virtual world of Zoom as we talked about how to address anti-Black racism in the ESL classroom. I teach ESL to adult students in a continuing education program at the secondary level, which follows the Ontario curriculum. Most of the students have the goal to graduate with the high school diploma. It is a diverse population in the program with students coming from places such as Eritrea, Iran, Taiwan, Afghanistan, and India. To understand how I addressed anti-Black racism in this context, we analyzed a few data sources. Yecid and I met once every 1 to 2 weeks online and discussed my recent experiences with the course, and he posed questions as a critical friend to my position as a teacher in the classroom. We shared resources, and I shared the activities I created, which became a part of the course content. From the field notes, which were reflections about this experience, we would chat about other supports I engaged in, such as professional development days, and what I'd coined as quote unquote subversive PDs or subversive professional development. These were moments when I was learning in informal context and sharing a space with colleagues to discuss and critique the system from which I was working within. It also included reading texts that challenged my preconceived notions of who I am and what I should do as an educator. Subversive PDs are different from PD days, which I define as formal sessions organized by the school board. And as I worked through and taught the course, Yecid was my sounding board during our coffee chats.
We're in the process of analyzing the data, and we're in the midst of putting it all together for publication. And what we wanted to share today is what we have learned throughout this process so far. And what we have found so far is that a three-step cyclical pedagogical process is at the core of this empirical exercise. So step number one, thinking, envisioning, and preparing the themes to engage the students. Step number two, presenting exemplars of the assignments for the lesson and engaging students with the pedagogical materials in which students reflect, produce, and share what they have learned from the class. And step number three, collecting feedback from the students to evaluate the challenges and opportunities for further lesson planning. So let's see how this process actually worked in the classroom.
So this is an example, a screenshot of a transcript for a YouTube video titled My Teenage Life Being Black in Canada by Cameron Davis on a Google Doc. The video was a starting point for us to talk about anti-Black racism, scaffolding the knowledge and skills so that they can complete an assignment on debating the following week. YouTube automatically creates a transcript, which I copied and pasted, making use of features such as highlighting and comments. Words and phrases were selected for vocabulary and idioms. The comment boxes were used to add questions for students to follow as we analyze and discuss the content of the video. These questions varied from focusing on the topic to literary devices. This also offered students an accessible way to copy the text for translation in their home languages and to follow along as a person was speaking. Investing the time to create these resources while adapting them from the original content provides options and allows for both students and teachers to navigate more easily online, especially when classes in my context were mostly online. And then the next slide, this is a screenshot of the assignment. And also most of the stuff that we did were presented on Google Docs for, again, accessibility. And because our school board uses the Google Suite as the platform for students and teachers to communicate on. This is the debate assignment, which was given to the students. And again, using Google Docs, students can click on links to additional resources. The question was, do you agree that the Canadian government has done enough to address racism? Some of you may be familiar with the online application Flipgrid, where students may make a short video as a response to prompts and questions. And this was used because firstly, it's approved by the school board, and secondly, students can reply to their classmates on this platform also by video. This made it very much possible for students to do a debate while being online and not in an actual physical classroom together. And so next I will talk about the challenges. So there were 4 key challenges that emerged from the data. The first was recognizing that raising the topic of racism and specifically anti-Black racism could be triggering and cause students to relive trauma. In the context of where I work in, we have a population of students that are newly arrived immigrants, students that are refugees, students that have very recently and maybe even like during childhood witnessed wars and such. So these are things that us as teachers and on staff have been very sensitive to and to really be aware of. Even though it's in the news and school boards are encouraging teachers to tackle the issue of anti-Black racism, I also found that there were a few teachers who did not feel that they were well equipped to handle the possible affective or emotional work that comes with teaching difficult issues. So in other words, they didn't feel like they were particularly prepped to know how to handle these things if students didn't feel safe or supported. So building trust and rapport between the teacher and their students takes time. Which brings me to the next challenge, time. The ESL program as part of the continuing education program runs for 9 weeks, or what we now call as a quadmester. This is quite a short time to build rapport with the 20 some students in my class that I was seeing some days online and some days in person. So it was a hybrid. It is also an intense course to meet all the expectations for a course based on the Ontario curriculum, which normally would run 4 months or what we call a semester in a regular day high school with adolescents. Then there are the resources. There is no shortage of content about anti-Black racism, as you can see from one of the resources I adapted from YouTube, but there isn't a lot of how to teach it, especially in my context with adults. So it's not just what kind of resources I could find, but also how to use them, such as making sure it's level appropriate, topic matters, or kind of something that they can connect to, and so on. And as you saw in the exemplars, teachers spend the time adapting material to their age level and the course, so students can access the content properly. Finally, throughout the process, I wavered back and forth between thoughts of, I need to talk about this and teach my students the skills to address this issue, to questions like, who am I to teach this? So I recognize that this lack of confidence and fear was my experience. Who am I to teach this? Am I an advocate, an ally, or an activist? What makes me to be the one in the position to speak on another person's experience? So these thoughts relate back to my positionality, and how I describe myself in the introduction, that there needs to be a constant awareness and transparency to who I am. I need to be aware of amplifying voices instead of simply speaking for or on someone else's behalf. I came to realize that these questions, hesitations, and uncomfortability were very much part of my process.
So one of the many things that we discovered was the pedagogical approach to teach English addressing issues of racism must be a continuous and ongoing process of, first, building a safe space for students. Second, teaching the necessary language skills so students can understand and speak about social justice issues. Third, engage students with actionable classroom activities so they learn how to actively and critically use the language for dismantling those binary mindsets of race and racism.
And as the teacher in the classroom, it was about teaching them the language and skills so that they can be an advocate, an ally, or an activist. It was about teaching them the vocabulary so that they can share their experiences, develop critical skills, and apply it while supporting others in an inclusive space. But building a safe space is where the groundwork needs to be done first. As previously mentioned, the teacher needs to acknowledge that discussing racism and specifically anti-Black racism can bring up trauma. This is not just the students, but also the teacher. This process takes time and scaffolding for the students and continual reflection for the teacher on their pedagogical practices necessary. And lastly, we'll talk about future implications and our conclusion. So there are multiple entry points for addressing anti-Black racism in this ESL course. From my experience, building critical skills by analyzing content which discussed anti-Black racism melded social justice issues with curriculum expectations. If we are going to teach students on how to have a debate, read news articles, or write an essay, why can't the content address anti-Black racism? Teachers do need to do the work teachers do need to do the work. And for me, there wasn't a clear picture of how to start, but I started the work because I wanted to do the work for students, and that's what matters. Like any critical skills I was teaching my students, I was learning, assessing, and reflecting on my criticality. So reflexivity is key to this process. By collaborating with Yecid, who is doing the research in the field of social justice, and having a continual conversation about this as I was teaching, we are closing the gap between theory and practice. This makes dual ethnography a very fitting methodology for understanding and analyzing how to address these important issues.
Definitely, and as researchers, the empirical exercise that we did with whales evidences the ongoing conversation surrounding alternative forms of conducting research that involve us, the lived experiences of the researchers on a deep, personal, and sometimes intimate level. In this type of research, which is in line with decolonial approaches to research, the inquiry process is geared towards supporting others, in our case, the English students, while also taking into account the needs of the community and ultimately the needs of society. So in other words, do ethnographic approaches must ultimately serve not only the most marginalized communities, but also serve as a platform for advocacy to fight against the struggle of those communities. In Wales examples, the students gain social awareness to ultimately attempt to make social changes, and we as researchers gain a more nuanced and introspective way of doing research with a pedagogical practice. So these are some of the selected references. Thank you so much for being with us today. These are our emails if you want to send us an email. And then we have a few minutes for questions.